How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Euler Gonzalez here, and let's going to look at the Model 1 of React and all the subtle nuances where we or that we need to know as we started to build this user interface and help, for example, some companies to build their internal dev tools or SaaS or uh, the landing page or some back office, right? Now, in today's video, we're going to look at finally is the last sections of this Model 1 and then move on to the next one. But to make a quick recap of how do we get here, because I do think it is quite important to do that after the end of this particular course. So let's get into this. So far we have looked at how can we now conditionally rendering elements using is, for example, expression, and we also, I also learned is the difference between the statement and expression in the most practical sense, and also how we can actually look at the spec to truly understand what is exactly an statement and an expression, right? Despite the term or the abstract concept, now we need to know is what is the concrete, what is the true behind this. So an statement either can be is an expression, it can be a block statement, if statement, as well as declarations, among other stuff. And I do think it is quite relevant for us to recap that, at least those two concepts, because we are going to make a huge difference in our code base and in our understanding of that. So if we take a look at this statement, right, so understand what is a statement from the annex, that's right, which is the annex here, grammar summary. I don't know why this doesn't give it the grammar summary statement, okay, but I don't know why this doesn't open up anyway. Yeah, the statement, so whether it's a block, a variable statement, and the variable statement is either a names that bounds to a variable declaration list, and this variable declaration list can be either is a variable declaration with the binding identifiers and the initializer, okay, or the binding patterns and the initializer. That can be either a yield or an await. So this binding pattern, whether it's an object or an array, okay, okay, is similar for the binding identifier, that is either an identifier that is an identifier name but not a reserved keyword, all right, and this identifier name is whatever name we provide that. uh, so it is identifier star, either Unicode or dollar or this or Unicode escape sequence, okay, and the Unicode unify started name or identifier part. It can be either of one of this. It can be a Unicode, any code point, which is the code Unicode properly, ID star, right? So an identifier, or sorry, a variable can begin is with a dollar sign or an underscore or even like this, and this is quite interesting that you can actually is define a variable like this. You say, hey, dollar, and you say, hey, the value of this is 1. You know, then when you come on, there you got it. And the other is that you can also is doing things like this. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Say 2, invalid or unexpected token. Unicode escape sequence. Exactly. Unicode escape sequence. Okay, you can also is defined as a Unicode sequence of values, which is we're gonna use something like this to say, hey, Unicode sequence of 3F4, and if we want to know what in the F is this, I just want to print that out, and the Unicode is this one. Um, no, but it's like this. Is Unicode and following is this an invalid token? It's either like this. Okay, reference error is not defined. But as you can see, we are now expressing its tokens here, right? We can now express some tokens, or it can be either something like this, right? And the Unicode. Okay. However, I don't know, like this. So it means that we can now assign this Chinese character as a var and then assign some value here, right? Let's say 5, some magic number. So you can define here variables like this. This is pretty mind-bending stuff. And if you want to have access to whatever value it is, that is quite interesting. Then this is an identifier that is going to look in memory and say, hey, I have this associated with. This is why when we are doing this is trying to look up for that. It's actually now at execution is evaluating is this. This is the runtime semantics, which is a fancy way from this to say, hey, this is what is going to happen when I run this, I evaluate this at runtime. Okay. So again, this is quite interesting, at least to understand that this is possible, especially for identifiers. Okay. And then, so these identifiers, which is, as I mentioned, all right, and or, but it cannot be any reserved word, right? Any keyword of the reserved keyword, which is away, break, case, all of this, right? Continue, debugger, default, delete, do, else, all of this. Finally, for, if, import, none of this. Try, type of, var, void, while, with, something that we're not gonna use that, and yield. All right, yield and away are permitted as a binding identifier in the grammar and prohibited with static semantics. Below to prohibit automatic semicolon insertions like this. So for example, we can do something like await and say something like this. It is a reserved keyword, all right, but in some context or yield, interesting. So in some contexts it is permitted. So you say yield, we can yield that as it is, all right? So this might quite silly because as we look at the binding declaration, that it can be either is a binding identifier or a binding pattern. And this is a binding identifier, as I mentioned, is either this, it is an identifier or a yield or an await, and followed by the initializer, which is this assignment expression. And in this assignment expression, it can be either conditional expression, which is something that we are looking in here, all right? In this React fundamentals, also to explore is the JavaScript, is the assignment expression, whether it's a conditional expression, that it, again, conditional expression, not a statement. And if you want to know what is a conditional expression, is either a logical or expression that is this one, or an I, and, or, which is each one of them is gonna produce, is gonna act like a gate that allow you to now return is the current value, giving a particular condition, and or the assignment expression, like this ternary operator, like that. So the conditional, the yield expression, which is, hey, we want this to now yield this value here, right? We want to yield the value. The arrow function is another expression. Interesting. The async arrow function is another expression, and the left hand side assignment and things like this, right? So, but this is just to describe is the assignment expression and how you can now, when you have when you want to initialize something, you can assign something to it, whether it is a conditional, whether it is an and or whether it is a this if else statement, or whether this is a yield expression or an arrow function or an async arrow function or a left hand side expression, and so on and so forth. So in other words, here this left hand side expression is new, and call expression, which is even including is a new member, all right, the new expression, or the call as well, with all of this cover, call, express, super call, with arguments, with an expression, with this, and the call argument with the template literal. So again, we can also ask some couple of questions here for the call expression to claw, all right. Provide some examples from the spec, from the JavaScript spec following text, right? Exactly, like the grammar production. So for example, like this is like, hey, cover, call, expression, and a sync arrowhead, whether it's this or like this, or even you can provide something like this. Hey, this is an async arrow function that is gonna do this kind of stuff. You can also do that with a call. You can assign that to a variable, or they call expressions, something that we're quite familiar with. All right, call expressions and accessing to the value. So if, for example, that function call returns now an object, so you can have access to the particular arrays or the props that this function is now giving to you, all right. Call expression yield as well as this char at go, or call expressions as literal, right? Foo template string function hello, and get formal value as it is. So again, the point of this is not to get lost into the details, but at the end of the day, is understanding is the overall definition between a statement and an expression. So here, this is why we look at the statement. What is a statement? Here, it can be a block, it can be a variable statement, it can be an empty statement, all right? An empty statement is just a column, right? It can be an expression statement, and here in this expression, we have is, as long as it doesn't have any of these initial values here, whether it's open curly brackets, function async, function classlets, and all of this, the expression in itself can be either an assignment or an expression. We already know what is an assignment can look like, whether it's a conditional, whether it's yield, or an arrow function, or an arrow async function, or a left hand side expression, okay. and then you have now the expression in it itself, right? So what is an expression is exactly runtime semantic evaluations. This is the comma operator. But again, an expression is this, right? Expression is statements. Runtime semantic evaluation. Let the expression ref be the result of evaluating an expression, whether it's an assignment or an expression followed by a comma. All right. All right. And then return the get value as it is. So, but the point of this is here is describing is how all of the things supposed to be. What is an expression and what is a value, and why when we look at this statement, whether it is a block, whether it is a variable, an expression statement, an if statement, a breakable statement, continuous statement, with statement, label statement, throw statement, try and debugger statement. So all of this is just the statement as it is, which is a call to action, right? And then we have another declaration, which is something aside from this, and the hostable declarations, again, something that is aside to this. And yeah, we'll understand now more deep into the, for example, block statement. What a block statement is actually describing is this, and a statement list, and so on and so forth, right? So a language in itself, here the spec that it might describe this in this algorithm way, this numerical algorithm way, alright, is pretty self-descriptive of how you can actually use this, or at least how JavaScript implementation, how JavaScript engine must implement this, because it turns out that despite that this is how it's supposed to look like, right? The TC39, which is the committee that oversee this spec, they don't have the full picture, not because they are ignorant, because again, it is a vast universe on the web to actually be very well aware of each one of those details, right? And especially those JavaScript engine that has implemented some and stuff and yada yada yada. Now, and some JavaScript engine can decide to not implement some of them, and we can find this here in the additional ECMAScript feature for web browsers, right? Where they're describing here for legacy reasons, there's some JavaScript engines that, well, might not implement all of this, and they have now a specific way of doing stuff, and so on and so forth. Good. So all of this was just to describe is, well, what is a statement and what is an expression, okay? And how an expression can be is, well, it's a variable statement. It can be is an arrow function expression. It can be a conditional expression, and this is why we actually hit the brake here a little bit to understand that, right? Because, well, this is indeed something that is relevant. So for example, if we take a look at the expression here, right, why this is important, right, and what are the primary expressions, whether it's an identifier, whether it's a binding identifier, or an async arrow binding identifier, label and primary expressions. This is identifier reference, is a literal, is an array, exactly. Anything that produce is a value usually. Identifier reference is a literal value, an array literal, an object literal, a function expression, and there's a subtle difference between a function expression and a declaration, something that we're gonna see that later. Class expression, generator expressions, async function expressions. So all of these are is indeed expressions. All right. How can we identify all of these expressions? Literal is another expressions. Array literal, element list, elision, spread, object literal, initialize. So all of these template span. Again, there is no need to actually memorize all of this, but just to understand that the language in itself is pretty strict when it comes to define what is an expression. Okay, unit expressions, updating expressions, left hand operators, exponential, multiplications, additive, relational expressions here, right? Equality expressions, which is when it comes to the type coercion, bitwise, SOR, or logical expression. And then you have now assignment expressions, right? So this is for sure the whole point of this. Okay, the idea is to get yourself familiar with each one of them, to determine what is an expression, what is a statement. Okay, and why we actually look at the conditional rendering and hit the brake a little bit to understand now what is a statement and what is a expression, and why this is useful, especially when it comes to render this specific HTML tag or components. Okay, so because at the end of the day, GSX only evaluating the template is expressions. Any one of this, all right, any one of this, the language is going to evaluate that. Okay, inside of the curly braces, well, this is what we can do. So now I understand for sure what is all of this, and the subtle difference between the statement, which is something that not produce a value, and a statement can be any of these. And a statement, for example, is, well, as I mentioned before, the block, the variable, the block, the variable, the even expression statements, the if statements, the break, the continue. It's interesting that it doesn't mention anything related to iterable statement. That is quite interesting. It doesn't mention anything like that, you know. Okay. So another statement is the declarations, whether it is hostable declarations, and in the hostable declaration we have functions declarations, generator declaration, async function declaration, async generator declaration. All of these are hosted. Okay, so the association between the identifier and the value happens at parse time. Okay, and then you have is, yeah, the declarations, the hostable declaration, class declaration, or lexical declaration. And lexical declaration is including is whether it's let or cons, and it is binding, right? As well as the breakable statement. With the unbreakable statement, it includes the iteration statement. Interesting that they mentioned, it called this as breakable statement. Iteration, switch, block statement, block, and as you can see, the long list of all of these statement that we can do here, right? So yes, and the list go on until debugger. All right. So all of this is just to make yourself familiar with this specific nature of the language that is pretty descriptive. It tells you what it is. It tells you what is a statement and an expression. All right, and how that is important when it comes to conditionally render components here. That's what we went through describing what is an if statement, what is the end statement, what is a ternary statement, why do we even care about using each one of them? what are the trade-off of using each one of them. For example, if a statement can only be at the function body, not at the render function, not at the template, and the double ampersand is that, hey, the double ampersand or the and in the ternary operator only happens at an expressions, and how can we use this in our template to express certain behaviors that we want when it comes to define is our layout. So all of this was quite interesting, and we also looked that not only for JavaScript we can do this, but also in CSS. And in CSS, it actually involved quite other stuff here. So not only that you are able to display this element, not only that you are able to display this element here, uh, how do you call it? Via this to manipulate the visibility of an object, all right, whether it is hidden or not, but also is to look at the way of how we can is change the element in it itself, all right. So and how this is when it comes to use now the accessibility. So there are small nuances when it comes to provide web apps that are accessible. So for example is how you can actually show a particular content to the reader, and so how you can now show content to the screen reader for these assistive technologies, and for those user who can read, right? And why we use a particular snippet to go with, and which is what we're doing here, what we're describing in today's video, is the range utility, okay? And the range utility is, well, some useful things when you don't receive now, when you get is an element, when you get now is a value, is a number, and then you want to, from that is produce certain sequence of elements, okay? And that's what we have here, like this. So range function code, yada yada yada. So this range function code is quite simple. It takes now the start, the end, and the step. Okay, and what it's gonna do is just to create is a sequence of elements, given that condition. Okay. So it's quite silly, honestly. The range is a, hey, I'm gonna declare is a collection where, given this parameter, I'm going to add this, I'm gonna create this sequence, and then I'm gonna return that, right? And this is exactly what it's doing here. It's pretty straightforward. It's checking if the value of the end is equal to undefined. All right, so if you don't provide any value here, it say, well, that'll be our n. The n will be the star, and the star will be 0. So it is assuming certain things here, by the way. And it's going to now iterate through that, right? So I'm gonna iterate from this until the end, and then I'm going to do that given the particular step, which is in this case is 1. And then going to add all of these elements into this collection, and then return you the collection. I do think this is quite interesting. In my particular case, because I do want to know is how you can actually create elements using the built-in tools, all right? So for example, like the Array.from, where you, in the first parameter you pass is the length, what'll be the what'll be the size of this, and what do you want to do to fill those elements in there, okay? So this might see this might seems like quite uh, random or weird for people who are not well aware of this. uh, I will continue to go with this specific stuff because they are from the language, and I would like to prefer to make to to make aware to all. Well, I don't know if anybody can do that or are willing to do that, but I do think that if the language suggests this is the particular pattern it's gonna follow is the functional approach, I'm gonna follow is this because there is a motivation of doing that, and they have a little bit more experience than I in doing so. Okay. However, when it comes to describe now code, it is honestly it is way much more better to use is a approach that is much cleaner, much easy to read like this, right? So yes, we can also use some load as range function from that. So for example, like this. All right, you say hey star and end. All of this now come from the JavaScript follow the IEEE standard for resolving a floating point value which can produce unexpected results. Exactly. Uh, but this piece of code, I would like to actually take a look at this, the source code, right? Let's explore what is doing this. Let's explore what is doing this. It say hey create range is gonna call this function here that it must be defined somehow. You got it. This is a function declaration. It say hey create a range of the range right function. Create a range or range right function. You provide now a boolean here, and it's gonna return now a function from this. Okay, so this function that is returning is now giving you this silly example. As you can see, you know, it's not it's not weird magic here. It's a hey, if the step exists and here we go with this and ampersand, which is something that we saw in the previous versions like this, right? This what is doing this silly things what it's doing is to say hey, if the left hand of the operation, if this produce any falsy values, I'm gonna short circuit it and then stop here and then return you that falsy value. That falsy value can be either is a this falsy value can be either is a zero or it can be zero, null, undefined, minus zero. You may wonder why, but there is a reason. The false as well as nan, an empty string. Okay, so if this return is any of this falsy values, all right, this is when you started to ask yourself, hey, can we assume that this specific values, or do we want to actually get something much more meaningful, right? But in any case, if we receive something that is this falsy values, it's not going to continue to evaluate and it's going to throw that, right? And if it is, it means that that step is going to make some assumptions in there. So here as you can see, it say hey to find it, which is to star. It's gonna call this another function here. I think this is a utility function to find it star, and then it's gonna ask this if n is equal to undefined. It means that we are going to so we don't receive any n here. So then we're going to assign that to the star, and the star will be now 0, right? Otherwise, call now to the end to find it, which is what is find it. I would like to go to the find it here to take a look at find it. Find it receives a value, and it say, hey, I want whatever value I'm receiving, I'm gonna check. I'm gonna check for it is falsy value, right? Interesting. So to find it, so here it's receiving is ensuring the sign of -0 is preserved. Okay, specifically this. So you say -0, and you do this. Exactly. So what it's doing is to so what it's doing is whatever value that you are receiving here is going to convert that. It's gonna check for that. It's gonna exactly. It's gonna check here. This is just a specific. Holy moly! It is a specifically checking for the -0 here. Hey, if this value, holy moly, is this value that I'm getting here? If I evaluate it to a boolean, if I coerce it to a boolean, and that gives me now true, it means that I need to return is a 0. Return value is equal to 0. Okay, so if the value is false, which is true when you pass any other numbers, except for 0 or -0. Okay, and then it's gonna now return the 0. Otherwise, toNumber is gonna call here toNumber, and toNumber is another function here. We're actually here is looking at and evaluating is this. Okay, if this type value is a number, returns a number. If it is a symbol value, return n. If it's object value, you're gonna check which type of this value of is equal to function or this value is object or okay, and then you call now the is object. All right, what it's gonna return you is a value here. So here what it's doing is this coercion. Convert value to a number. Interesting. If the type of value is a number, return the value. If it is a symbol, return not a number. If we're trying to coerce a number that is an object, okay, we need to call is the value of this primitive that it comes here. We need to check if the function exists, value of, and if it exists, I want to call it, or just return the value. Whatever value we get in there, okay, then I want to call is object method, which is here, is checking if the type of object, if the type of object is different to null, exactly, and the type of object, exactly. So if this is not a null, and if it is an object and a function, it means that this is an object. You know, quite silly. And it's going to return you is the value of this operation. So in other words, it's going to return you is the evaluation of this expression. All right? Since this is now evaluating is this or this, okay, it's going to return you now whether it is an object or a function. How do I know this? Let's check this out. How do I actually true that is gonna do that? Well, glad you asked. So if I say, for example, value, say let value here, this, and I say object, it will return me is the value of object. Value is not defined. Value is not defined here. Interesting, but I do define that. Oh, it's because, okay. Exactly. So what it's doing is this. Okay. So var type to actually get that. So for example, if we get now an object here, and then later on we say this type, let value, let type, and here we want to determine the value of this, which is value. All right, and then we want to evaluate what is this. All right, I just want to evaluate this expression and give me is the proper value that I expecting. In this case is object. Okay, it's a type is not defined. That is quite interesting. Type is defined. Exactly. Yeah, type is defined. Let me reload this. So yeah, type is defined. I do expect to return me is the object and not the So because it's evaluating is this and this, let me check this, bro. Let me check this. Let me check this, which is the logical operator. Here we got it. There you got it. Exactly. Is this one. Let the result logical an expression and evaluate like this get value. I do think this is an older version anyway. Let bool to bool, alright? And if the bool is false, return the left value. Whatever left value it is. Okay? Let the ref be the result of evaluating bitwise or expression. Let the right be the result of evaluating bitwise or operation. And return get value ref. Oh, and it's returning is a get value this because yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It say, hey, what is the evaluation of this? What is the evaluation of this? Because here what it's doing is doing this comparison here. And this comparison actually return you is a value, which is the comparison. Not strict comparison. Let's go to the abstract here. Is this one. So here what it's going to check is say, hey, if both of them, if the type, which is a string in this case, is the same as this, all right? If both of them are the same type, okay? In this case, if both operands are the same type, all right? in this case a string, okay, exactly, if type X is the same as the type X, then it's going to do this strictly equality, and what it's going to do is to say is this, right? If the type X is different from type G, no. If the type X is a number, right? No. Return the same value non-number as it is, right? If the type F is a string, then if X and G are exactly the same sequence of code units, the same length and same code units are corresponding indexes, return true. Otherwise, return false. And this is all of this. So this operation is returning is now the true value, okay, which is short circuits and say, hey, I'm gonna give you this value here. I'm gonna give you this, the value of this the value of this operation. And it makes a lot of sense to actually do that. And it makes a lot of sense to actually give it to us this. Right? So all of this journey for a single silly thing to evaluate is this, okay, which is an object, okay, to evaluate is this is an object to say, hey, it is true or false, and if it is true, if we are receiving is a value that is an object, okay, we want is to get is the other, okay, and try to coerce that into a value plus this one. So we're gonna evaluate is this. So in other words, what it's gonna do is to take that value and doing this string concatenation to actually force that. And when we do some string concatenations like this, so for example with a number plus a string, what do you think we're gonna win? It's gonna now, this operation coerce that into a string. You know? So it's gonna coerce that into a string. If this is an object, if it's not an object, then we're gonna return is the other. And gonna continue to evaluate this as it is. Free parse ins and all of this kind of stuff. But the thing here is that this silly operation, this silly thing, is actually going deeper into the root of JavaScript, which I know that might be quite overkill for this example of the range utility, but it's quite useful to understand is, for example, this particularly a statement on how we can conditionally render elements in each one of them. Okay. All of this is with just by looking is at the range here. And how the range is actually much more, wants to cover is a ton of things or a ton of different use cases given the specific value we provide to actually make sure that we get what we need to. That is why my bandit stuff, bro. That is why my bandit stuff. That is why my bandit stuff. That is why my bandit stuff, bro. I must admit. That is why my bandit stuff. I must definitely, I definitely must admit. I definitely must admit. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. But as you can see here, this library, all right, that is compressed of all of this is just simple set of statements to describe what we can do and how can we do it and so on and so forth. And in this case with the create range, it's just like that. It's gonna give you now a function. In other words, it actually is creating is a closure, right, of this variable from right to, well, give it to you is the specific range that you want to create, that you want to build here. So as you can see, function start end and step, right? If the step and type of step, as you can see, well, it all start with describing here. So let's move on here fairly quickly to read this. If the step exists, right? If the step is not a falsy value, then I'm gonna let you get into the next step, to the next statement, to the next expression, which is, well, give me now the value of the step, and if that value is different from a number, all right, then I will let you now is move through the next operation here, or to the next expression, which is iterate call, right? Again, this is another function inside. But the thing here is that this, what it does is to preserve the zero to find it, okay? And here's when the actual happen magic kicks in, right? What they're doing is just to say, hey, if the step, so we're gonna do is something like this. So we're gonna assign is to the step, which is something that we already have here, okay? And I want to check if the step is undefined, and if it is undefined, okay, I'm going to now start and do this kind of stuff, right? I'm gonna evaluate if this and say star is later is less than n, and if it is, give me 1. If it's not, give me -1. This is just a convention that is using. Otherwise, all right, if this is undefined, so well, I want to now call it to find it, to ensure the sign is here. And then now is returning is something called the base range. So base range is another function here that is the responsible for iterating here. It's interesting that they don't use is any of the for loops. It's quite interesting. They don't use any for loops. They just use is while and do while. So base range, base implementation of the range, which doesn't coerce arguments. Okay. So it's gonna take is the index, the length, native max, native ceiling is given to this, end and star. So I want to get it the different from here to get how many elements do I need to, yeah, how many elements do we have here, and I'm going to divide is by the step and say if the step exists, all right. Well, let's gonna use it. If not, let's going to assume this is 1. Okay. All right. All right. And then, and again, this is very specific method for them. And then this is just to calculating is the length of this. And then result to the array dot length. An array exactly is a built-in method that say, hey, this will be now the length of this. And what it's gonna do is to decrement from the length. All right. That's quite interesting the way how this actually is doing, because they know that the while operation is going to evaluate to a falsy value, And if you decrement length until you reach to 0, you don't need any fancy behaviors here. Holy hell. That is using as the tool to your advantage. Very, very interesting. Very, very, very interesting. So if you want to now iterate through this, okay, one useful, as long as you know the length, one useful ways to do that is going into this. Okay, result from right. Okay, and then you get is this. You say, hey, oh, okay, is this one. So what it's gonna do is to ask the question here. You say, hey, from right, if from right exists, it's not a falsy value, okay? If that exists, if this is a true t value, then I'm gonna give you now the length. All right. So that'll be is the length of this from the result array. And that position is gonna be now the star, and the star will be now plus the step, and so on and so forth. But if you don't have any from right, specify, and you got it. Specify iterating from the right to left. Okay. However, if from right does not exist, we're gonna now use the index and the star from left to right, or the other is from right to left. Okay, that's interesting. So okay, so starting from top to bottom and so on. How old is this code? How old is this code? Can I look at the year of this code? Yeah, that'll be quite interesting to look at this code. Yeah, but well, at least you, J Dalton. Sometimes TC39 delegate protecting supply chains at socket.dev, X, Bond, Salesforce, Node Core, Electron, W, Microsoft. Ah, I get it. But it doesn't mention is how old is this code. Yeah, this is the raw code, and this is the code. But what if I want to look at how old is this code? 6 years ago. Okay. Okay. No, wait a single moment. Wait a single moment. Jesus, come on. Hello? Can you come back here? Okay. And the blame doesn't tell you? Doesn't give? That's interesting. What about the code? And the code doesn't tell you this? Anything? Well, in any case, I just view git blame. Yeah, we're asking a specific feature to the database for this. Referencing the discussion. Yeah, but they don't anyway. So yes. So yep. They actually mentioned that. Uh, but the point of this is that I actually take a look at this range utility, and despite that we have this simple alternative to create arrays dynamically, all right, he wants to make a point here, and I sure, yeah, he wants to make a point here, and I sure that this is something that it will go through a lot of people that want to ship code. It wants to somehow ship code that is uh, that is perfect, that is that feeds their ego and that kind of stuff. By being is quite verbose, so on and so forth. Verbose or clever code, and you have to be careful with clever code, unless you truly understand that. And even though simplicity is way much more, uh, simplicity get things done. Simple code get things done. Mm, my vintage range definition is verbose and basic, but it's work flawlessly, and I can make it sense of it without burning any calories. That's the most important things for me. Like this, we can also use is that for the Array.from, right? There is a better alternative using modern JavaScript that allows to create this. Uh, where we want us to identify is how many elements we want us to create, and given the step, we're gonna now increment that to 1. And then the mapping function that say, hey, what you want to do with this particular number, right? For each one of them, I want to multiply is that by the step, for example. I want to populate is that with this step. So yeah, I do think that this is quite. It makes a lot of sense to set this as a case for that. Let me take some notes here on the React Dev, the joy of React, the joy. Come on, man. The joy of React. Oh my God, why you don't want to pull it up? The joy. So React. For real? Okay. You don't want to help me here? No problemo. This is not. There you got it. Okay. Okay. It makes a lot of sense to at least talk about that. Yes, to at least talk about it. To at least talk about it. And I want to let it on exactly supporting screen readers. The exercise of supporting screen readers. And so, for example, like this. Mm-hmm. Supporting screen readers. Exactly. Supporting screen readers. And there's some issue with supporting is that. And the other is user profile with badges, which is the another example here. Exactly. Mm. Okay. And then the user profile example here. Mm-hmm. 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 Now we get it. Now we get it. Exactly. Now we get it. Okay. Now we truly get it. And then we got the range utility. So for exactly like the range utility. Mhm. With the range utility. As we saw in a couple lessons ago, we can use map to iterate over an array to render one element. Exactly. So we we can render elements using the dot map. Exactly. Using the dot map using the dot map to iterate. We can render elements. We can render a collection of elements using the dot map to iterate over. Exactly. So by iterating on them. All right. So but what if we don't have an array? For example, it is common for rating to use 5-star system, and let's suppose we want to render 0 to 5 little star icons depending on the rating. Spend a few minutes poking at the problem, and your goal is to render n star inside of the star rating counting here. So we looked at silly example of how can we do that. Right? Exactly. Solution 1. So solution 1, doing this. Exactly. Solution 1, doing that. Mhm. Solution 1. Exactly. Solution 1. And then we also have is the solution 2. And then you have the solution 2, which is a little bit more verbose, right? Quite frankly, much more verbose. Mhm. Solution 1 and solution 2, right? A little bit more verbose. Uh, mhm. So the difference, exactly. So solution 1, normal code, normal code. It's a straightforward solution, right? And then you have another functional approach. a functional approach. Mm, In the solution 3, exactly, which is built-in JavaScript functions, and the other is the functional approach. But again, the problem the functional approach solves is to produce or to generate calculation, to compute something. When the problem is to compute something in an expression, great. But when you do need to cooperate across different nodes, cooperate or coordinate now, this is when object programming comes handy here. For loop or iteration statement. Okay, it's just an iteration statement. Built-in JavaScript functions and the functional approach. There is no wrong. There is no good or wrong. The idea is to highlight what the range approach here, or the range function here is using a built-in function from Lodash. Okay, you take a look at the Lodash, going back to the Lodash, and then we find that is, which is range from Lodash. Okay, a popular library, a popular functional library that in this case it is much more straightforward when it comes to describe code, to describe and to understand the intention in which the code was written. And there is no good or wrong. We can do this. Here, use a built-in function. Okay, the range function here, use a built-in function from Lodash, a popular functional library, which in this case is much more straightforward when it comes to describing and understanding the intention behind the code. So, because with range, we can create a simple function like this. All right. So range function code which is the range function code. Okay, the range function code right? So despite that this might look like, despite that this might look, despite that this is more verbose, it is quite obvious to the reader to understand what is doing. And there is no good or wrong. The idea is to highlight that when you want, so the idea is to highlight that in productions environments, being simple is what get things done. Or simplicity uh, so there is no good so there is no good or wrong. The idea is to highlight that in production environments, code that will be read by other people or by other engineers being clarity is what get things done. So you don't have to burn extra additional additional calories to get it. So you don't have to burn extra calories to get it. Okay. Exactly. So you define is your function is right below here. So yeah, you define your functions right below here. Mhm. Yeah, clever code considered harmful. Okay. Well, I do think that, yeah, if we can move on to the next one, to the range exercise, grafting. Well, I'll make a quick pause here, and I'll be right back. And we're back. So, let's get into this. Let's get into this exercise, right? Shall we? Okay. Grafting. Later in this course, we'll dig into different server-based rendering strategy. I am well aware of that. To help explain how everything works, those lessons have embedded dynamic graph like this one. Uh-huh. So first pane, content pane, right? So the app render on the server, exactly. Then once it's delivered, right? So one is bundle up, and so once it is transpiled and bundle up, uh, it is then delivered to the client, whatever client it is. In our case, a browser. Your JavaScript engines parse that or download that and parse that, execute that code, all right, which is something that it doesn't describe this, to ultimately now hydrate or provide interactivity to the component. So this is the default, all right, and this is the lazy load, all right, and that is quite interesting. When I build stuff like this, I generally don't use data visualization libraries. Instead, I construct them myself using friendly everyday DOMs node. Mm-hmm. 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 You are creating here a sequence of all of this, all right? And this sequence, at they don't align perfectly, as you can see. They don't align perfectly. But it is in this exercise, we'll reconstruct the bottom edge of this graph. Oh, that's what we're talking about. It's a more practical approach of building and creating all of this kind of stuff. Below, you will find a graph component that has some example markup. All of its style has been provided. Your mission is to update the code so that it renders a correct number of page. Hey. Well. Mm. That level of detail, bro. Okay, your mission is to update the code so that it renders the correct number of peg based on the props that the components receive. So here we're gonna create is a graph. The graph component should be used to provide range functions to generate the correct pegs for the given from and to props. The peg should always increase by 10 and be inclusive of both the from and to values. Oh, okay. You can assume that the from and to will always be multiples of 10. There shouldn't be any key related warning in the console. To clarify some of the accepting criteria, here's some examples showing the UI we expect to produce based on different from and to values. So if I give you this, it gives you this. If I give you 20 here, it gives you this. So no matter the range it provides, it will go that from 10 to 10. Okay, so how will you to produce this? Well, how you think that you should produce this? If I want to identify that this is in a straight line, right, and then I want to add some sections to this, one way to construct this is by saying, now that I have this block in which I want to put all of these different elements here, so since we can use flexbox to do that, I can say, hey, flex, make this container a flex, all right? And all of these elements that are defined here, I want you to display that next to them, right? This is one. And from the beginning and the end, I want to now start from the middle. Something like this. So what can we do here is this. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 sections. From 20 to 7, we have 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections. All right. And if we, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4 sections. Okay. So subtracting the difference here, so or getting the absolute value and then subtracting the from and to, where we give now the how many slots do we have here. Now that I have how many slots do we have, how many elements we're gonna create here, I also want to is on the beginning of this element, put in the end and in the and exactly. And at the beginning of this element, now use that. So how are you about to create this? That's a very interesting exercise. Everything here is a box, right? So since everything is a box, okay, what I can say is to say I'm going to render is these 4 boxes here, and all of these 4 boxes right below here, okay, and I want to somehow put this stuff here in the middle as well as in this. So it is helpful for us to think about this and say, since all of this is since after all of this is a box, right? Everything here is a box. Everything here is a box. And so one way to do it is to say, hey, I want to put another box on the top and a box on the bottom, okay? Where the box on the top or just simply doing this. I have one box, and in this box I'm going to draw is this particular line. Hmm. 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 And the peg. And the peg here. Hmm. And the peg here. I am curious about how do you actually create this graph and this peg. That's what I'm curious about. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So you have this graph, and then you have this another one. And I know that by using is a flex, you're saying, hey, I want to put all of these elements here. And since I don't care about which elements is, I don't care about which element is here. I don't care about which elements here is. But what I do care is that each one of those will show is a particular value there. So all of it will be now a flex. So no matter how many elements I added, each one of them will be fall into that. And then I will have this and this. Mm-hmm. In the middle, exactly, in the middle of this, mm-hmm. In the middle of this, what you're doing is to say, hey, I want to create now is, it's because it allows you to now draw elements inside. Okay. It allows you to draw this kind of elements here, or lines here. Because that's what it's doing, is just a line here. It's just a single line. Exactly, because otherwise creating is all of this. But because this is at the end of the day is an element, oh, by adding these elements here or after that, since this is a box, you can actually use for decoration. This is when the wisdom comes in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is when the wisdom kicks in, bro. Mm-hmm. So if for some reason I say is um, a class graph graph class, and then you say here, hey, this will be now is display flex followed by exactly show all of these elements as it is. I want to render this here. Okay, so graph class will be flex here, also is flex, because by default it render all of this, but I do want to render it as a column. So flex flex direction, column, row, display flex direction is this, and flex direction, column, exactly, but flex direction. Yeah, I just want to recreate this, bro. I just want to recreate because I do think that it's important. Flex direction, call row, flex direction row, and with all the available space 100%, right? Object, okay. Parsing error. Is a style as it is. Okay, now it's getting it. So now it's working. Alright. And I can say is take all the available space, view width. Alright. But I do want to expand all of that. So I can say is flex direction. So this is width, all right. And I do want to take is the flex, but I do want to take is and say, hey, I want you to take all the available space here and distribute evenly. So justify content even. Now justify content center is gonna put in the center, between, justify center, so align self. No, but it's justify content is, I'm a little bit rusty here. It's because I didn't do this here. Justify content space around, but it's space between. Exactly, space between, like this. All right. So what we did is to say, hey, each one of those elements, I want you to put in and space them between them. Add a space between them. Okay. So far so good. And then we can say, hey, you know what? We can show is a border box. So border, 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 shadow, border, border color, border, border width of 1 pixel, right? And then you say is border color light black, border width, border color here, or we can just simply say this one. So border and the shorthand property you put now is the border thin, so 1 pixel thin black. I think this is how you can do this. Holy moly, is that okay? Border shortcut CSS. Jesus God. CSS shorthand, bro. Border pixel solid and red. Okay, I wasn't that far away. So pixel border solid pixel, so I wasn't that far away. Solid, and then you get it. And here you can say, hey, we're gonna put it there or 3. All right. But I do wanna say is only border top like this, right? So things started to make quite a little bit sense of how can we do this, but yet we have this specific border that I don't want to put it here. So if I say space around, no, space between, okay. So actually the counting is in the middle. Okay. Now what I can do is to add this specifically here. Again, this is how I thought that how can we actually create this small range stuff here as it is. However, we still have is now this particular issue with this. It's that we have too much of that. So what we can say is to say, hey, padding of um, top and bottom 0, and that is going to the 2 pixels both sides. Okay, it is margin. Alright, you can say it's 16 pixels. Okay. 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 Space between. And this particular peg is just to add in that class as it is. You say peg, and here you say, hey, let's going to add this before class name peg to do this kind of stuff. And here, because now this won't behave as a normal style as we want is to target now all other stuff. But again, because this go beyond the scope of this video, but the idea is that I know how to create at least this kind of stuff. Perhaps not the way they actually doing here with a graph. Say class name and added this with graph. And then you add some margin here. Okay, so it's like we were doing some magic here. So here we add this margin, say margin, like this. But it doesn't work in this domain. Yeah, it doesn't work in this domain. So in any case, so class name, which is this, graph class, Jesus, I mean it's a graph in lowercase, right? And I do want to know how it actually is doing that. Position relative of the display, justify counting evenly in margin here, and each one of those elements is because now it's putting now a content here with this. Okay, so after this and this particular box, or before this box, I want to draw this line here. I want to draw this line here. Because this is absolute. And then draw this one. peg first child. And then the peg is this, which is the width of that, followed by the content. It's interesting because all of these boxes is doing this. So you have now these boxes after and okay, so you're playing is with this. So you're playing is with this, with all of these particular boxes. Okay, okay. So you're playing with all of these particular boxes. Good, good. Good, good, good. So the graph component should use to provide range functions to generate the correct pegs for the given from and to props. The peg should always increase by 10 and be inclusive of both the from and to values. You can assume that from and to will always be multiplied of 10, and there shouldn't be any key related warning in the console. So we want is to now use the range to actually show all of this, right? We get is that from and to values. So if we do wants to render here, for example, what is the from and what is the to? 40. Okay, so we get this value from here. Good. We get this particular utility function, and now we're going to iterate to this. But before going into that, interesting. Exactly. And the space evenly. Exactly. And the space evenly. So so with this, all right, we want to now render from here to there. Since we know that this range, we pass the start and the end with no step, or in this case will be is just step 10. The idea here is to receive this from intent, pass through the range, which will generate is now a collection of all the elements that we want is to render inside of that, right? As well as their values. So the way how can we do that is we're gonna get is these functions and receive the start and the to, as well as the step, which is something that we can assume that it will be by 10. Okay, we can assume that from and 10 will always be multiplied of 10. All right, so the graph component should be used to provide range functions to generate the correct peg for the given from and to props. The peg should always increase by 10 and be inclusive of both the from and the to values, and you can assume that from and to will always be multiplied of 10. Good. So the peg will be the peg should always increase by 10 and be inclusive in both the from and to values. You can assume that from and to will always be multiplied of 10, which is great. So that will be the step. And now we have everything that we need to before actually going to code. So this is the range function, the start and the or the from and the to. This will be the step, like 10, and I want you to render each one of those elements because you're gonna give us a collection that we already have those values in there. So in other words, range and passing here the from and to and the step, that will give us, because here is going to evaluate is the length here. All right, look at what is actually returning. Is say, hey, 0, and then 10, and then it's 20, and then it's 30. Okay, this is what this evaluation is, this expression is giving us. uh, but this, since this give us a collections, we can iterate through all of this and say, let's say the value. Okay, all right, and then I want to now here to say something like this, from to, and give me the value, and this is what I want to render here. So this is something that is powerful, very powerful, when it comes to use uh, JavaScript as a template engine. And I do think that is mind bending stuff. You know, it's like mind bending stuff. It's like mind bending stuff. However, because we are iterating through elements, and since each one of those elements actually is a React element, which is when you transpile this, it'll be is in the in this shape React.create element, right? With the name of the div, in this case the div, followed by some props, all right, and in this case is the class name, right? The class name. Um, is the class name with the name in this time graph, right? And this will be is now where you're gonna render is the other children's here, you know, or the content here, which is now an array of all of this. React.create element, and I'm doing this is just for the sake of the example here, which is a div is quite the same here, right? And this will gonna be a peg, all right, with the value of this expression that we're going to render here. Or in other words, we can say something like this. Hey, I want you to evaluate this, okay? And anytime that you find this, I want you to create now an element here, okay? I want you to create now an element here, say react.create element, where this is the div and this is the props that I want to pass as an object, right? Followed by the value that we're injecting to. Okay, there you go. So if we do this, it's the similar of us to saying something like this, like, hey, I want you to evaluate this, be my guess. Right, you can is say now is this. All right, and the export is this. Yeah, I know I'm quite overcomplicating stuff here, and say graph, for example, but this will be is the graph here, functions, and what is going to be outputted to. But the thing here is that with all of this, all right, this is what is going to be generated. Okay, this is what is going to be generated. And here we can say, hey, I want you to provide now a class where, since the value are quite unique, we can actually say something like this. And if we go out to the exercise.
So we begin this exercise with a couple of hard-coded pegs that are really sort of here to show us what we're trying to create. What we want to do is generate some number of these elements based on the props that have been provided. And so I'm going to start by calling the range function. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens if we use the props verbatim. So if I grab the from and the to, and I use that as the start and the end for my range. Then I'm going to call .map. I'm going to pass a callback function. And essentially, I'm going to render one of these pegs for each one. I'll also get rid of the other two pegs, and I'll replace this hard-coded 0 with the current number. Now, when I do this, we see that things are pretty chaotic. We have way too many pegs. They're spilling out of the viewport. And this is because, by default, range will generate all of the values between these two numbers. What I want to do in this case is only do 1 out of every 10 of these values. And I can do that with the third step argument. When I do this, things are much more calm, much more under control. They're still not quite right. Like, we're going from 0 to 30, but if I look in app...
Oh, exactly. So things are not quite right here. Because you need to also include is the 40 as well. So one way to fix this is to say, hey, 2 plus 1, that will be one of them. It won't be some magic number. I wouldn't encourage 2, right? And the other is to modify is the function here to actually is include that the n, which will be way much more better. And now, my friends, we actually fix this.
We're actually trying to generate a graph from 0 to 40. The reason this is happening is that our range function starts at the first value. It includes that number, but it doesn't include the second number. It goes right up to, but not including that number. And I realize this seems pretty arbitrary. Like, if I call this range function with 0 and 5, you might very well assume that it goes from 0 to 5 inclusive, right? Including all of those numbers. The thing is, though, this would actually mean that our array has 6 values, even though we're only going up until 5, and that doesn't really feel quite right either. This all stems, I think, from the fact that JavaScript is 0 indexed, right? So if we have an array, the first index is 0 rather than 1. This means, for example, if I have an array with 3 items, like apple, banana, and carrot, it means that the indexes go 0, 1, and 2. And so the indexes are always less than the total number of items in the array. And that's sort of what we're trying to coordinate with when it comes to this range function. And so even though it seems pretty arbitrary that it doesn't actually include this second number, it's usually what we want. That said, this is one of the rare cases where we do want to include both the start and end number. And so what I'll do for that is I will add 1 to the end number. That way we go from 0 to 41 in this case because we're adding 1 to this end value. And so we wind up generating an array that goes right up to 41 but actually ends at 40. Now this is looking pretty good. I do see I have some stuff going on in the console, and if I refresh, I see that I have a key warning. I'll solve this by adding a key to this div, and I'll use the num that we're iterating over as that value. With that done, we've met the final acceptance criteria, and we can now mark this one as complete.
In my particular case, actually modify is the utility function. But usually in real life scenarios, you don't want to mutate or change is some of those functions because this is something that is going to be used by a lot of teens. So what you want to do is use is this instead. So if I refresh, then I get no error. I think that the overall and useful things is to see how can you generate is this graph. Here, see how you can generate is all of these elements here, and how it's using now is the before and before elements to actually use some decorations here. Do some decorations here. Rendering a grid. Suppose we're building a Scrabble-like word game, and we want to render a grid of HTML elements like this. I am well aware how to do that. All right. Here's what the DOM structure looked like for the two grid. Exactly. There's a repeated code. Right? Your mission is to replicate this structure for a variable number of rows and columns. Okay, but for a variable number of rows and columns, accepting criteria, you have been given the template for a grid component, which will be provided with a num rows. Okay, you will be the given template grid component, which will be provided with a num rows props for the number of rows, and the nums and a num col props for the number of columns. There should be x div with a class of rows where x is equal to the number of rows. Exactly. Inside of each row there should be a x g or y. There should be y div with a class of cell where y is equal to the number of columns. Right? So far so good. We have num rows and num cols. So num rows must have a div with a row class that equal to the row, and the other is the row, and the other is the cell div class with the equal number of columns, right? So you should use the provide range function to solve this problem. So there shouldn't be any key related warning in the console. No, the console isn't clearly automatically when the warning are fixed. You can refresh the preview pane with the refresh icon. This is a challenging exercise and will require a bit of creative problem solving. It is 100% alright if you can solve it, but it's spend 15 minutes giving a shot, and then check out the solution video below. I do think it's quite straightforward, alright? Because it is, hey, I want to render is this number of rows, okay? The number of rows and then the number of columns, right? So on each row, okay, I want to render is each one of those columns. So the structure will be is that yes, we have now a row column. We have also is the row div that wrap all of the columns in there, and then we have now the inside of this box we're gonna have all of this column rendering inside of that, right? So it is quite interesting exercise. We can start by saying is this is the number of rows and the number of columns. So I'm assuming that there is Okay, I'm not gonna provide any stop condition to the range function here, or the n, so it will assume that it's gonna start from 0 to 1. Okay, so before any code, the idea here is to, well, uh, having a div, which is a box that will represent is the row, and inside of the row I'm going to put is as many div as needed for the column, right? And similar for this, and you get the idea. So let's get into this. We can say is, hey, I want to, or here, right? Hey, I want to do this. Say, hey, range of the num rows. So I want to now is map here, and since I'm gonna get is now the number of rows, say num rows, I'm gonna say rows, okay, and it's here that I want to actually render that, right? So behind the scenes what it's doing is to create that element for us, okay, and now add this. Okay, so here we're gonna render is the row, right? The row with a class row, my bad, singular, right? Row. Another question is that what is the num of rows, at least for this exercise? Is 8. All right. So it seems that we need to is render all of the rows, right? So we got all of the rows here already rendered. So good, good. So now that we have all of the rows, okay, next I want to is inside of this row, which is after all they are boxes, all right, boxes, 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 boxes. I want to render inside of this is the columns, which is doing something like this. Again, a range of the num calls, all right, and it's actually great because it's telling me how many columns do we have. We have 6 columns, which is this one, not that, not like that. We have more, okay, but in any case I want to for each one of them now render is a div where this is the, I will call this row, I will call this call, right? And then I do want to render is this div with the class name of call or cell, okay, cell, and then yep, this is it, this is it. So if I can say, I can say something like this, and then render, but to put some numbers inside of that, yeah, just to put some numbers. So all of this, actually this is not that hard, all right. However, because on each one of those iterations we need to tell React that, hey, you need is a key, you need to identify this React element uniquely, all right. For the sake of this exercise, we can do is this, right? Say now a row, and here key you pass now a call. Exactly. Invalid is because it's class name. There you go. So it was actually quite simple for me to render this collection of elements, right? Which I do find is not is trivial. It's part of the day-to-day activities, part of the day-to-day life. But I do think is that the grid here component, where I can say is because it doesn't allow me to access to the grid class or the grid class, right? It'll be something like this. You say display flex, all right? Display flex. And if I do this, okay, I'm showing is all of these different elements in a flex, right? So an indicating is that how many of them is being created. So the question is, I'm assuming, look at this. So it create now in a different way. Now it create that gray. It create that gray. So here, each one of those rows is now a flex as it is. So you can take a look at this. Let me actually go here, inspect the element and say something like this. You know, so you can see the row in itself is creating this box, because at the end of the day, everything in CSS is a box. So you have now this box, all right? And here you're gonna now put all of these little boxes here. Because now row actually has that, because you can actually just put it here and not passing any gap to the row. And similar to the cell, which is how you're going to now color that by putting as a border. Interesting. Let me actually is creating is that make sure it's creating is this. I know this is something that you're not gonna do in React, but what I do think is that this is why we have solutions like CSS in JavaScript, Emotions, GS, and so on and so forth. But it's to actually allow you to do this kind of stuff. So I just want to go with the cell, right? And here say cell class. Here this will be now border with 1 pixel, solid, and HSL function, the color function, hue, which is 300, right? This is representing the color, color, HSL, hue, saturation, and lightning. Saturation, let's say this will be is 100%, and the lightning we want to represent is the true color of this, which will be this. And when I add this to the cell via GSX, and it's gonna render that as expected. So you got this border, right? but I do think it's because we need to add some cell class. Oh, because this must be a style, not a class. Exactly. Yes. And here we need, of course, to because it's rendering all of them as it is. Display flex and the row oh, of course. It must be is the row class. So it's not here. Class is grid. And here we're gonna provide now the row from that. Okay. So all of those rows, of course, are showing in that particular way. Where what do we want is to say something like this. Row class one okay, so what do you want to do? I want to represent is now this grid. But over here. And exactly because here you are using is that. So here this grid will represent is okay. So what I want to do is to represent this flex box now to render all of these elements as it is, and then as it is, and then as it is, and then as it is, right? So to do that, we need to say that this grid class is indeed a flex box. All right. So grid class here will be now the style here that is going to render this, and now it is actually rendered as it's supposed to, right? So this belongs to the one, and this is the second, and then it's the third. You know, as you get it, you get the idea here. We can also replace this, right, by saying is the style. This can become quite obnoxious, but you get the point of this. So we actually create this, right? We can also just adding this a little bit more of width from this, a width of, let's say 10 pixels, right? Something like this. Or you can add now one root element, say 3 root element, 2, and the same for the height, right? The height by saying is 2 root elements, and something like this, right? So, but the point of this is we are able to create now. You can also say something like this to actually change the hue, right? 40. If we want to now add some saturation, something like this. But you get the idea of this, right? Now we're able to create this grid, okay? And I know why this is so annoying, bro, to create this grid with pure JavaScript. It is annoying. It is annoying, my friend. It is annoying, bro. It is annoying, and I want to actually do this. Range utility, and then the exercise, right? So solutions, this is solution 1. So pure JavaScript, how lengthy, verbose, painful, yada 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 it is to make that kind of stuff. You don't definitely wanna do that. Not at all. It's not fun. It's not fun, I can say. Yeah, it's not fun, bro. It's definitely not fun. Not only this, now let me create this as a React element. Holy fuck. So if we do want to translate this, I don't want to do this on foot. No, in fact, yes, I do. Yes, I do. So the React.create element, for example, just to return something basic here and say, hey, this is the grid. All right. And I do want to export that function like this. And return this. React is not created, but you say, hey, import React from React. It say, hey, import React from React. It's like I crashed this. It's like I crashed this. That's interesting. Create element, and there is no error here. There is no error here. That's interesting. React.create element. That's interesting. Mm. Oh, okay. It's because this thing. Okay, but it works. It means that class name must be is grid, and it's gonna show something here. So it works. So it works. You know, this is actually at the end of the day what a React element is behind the scenes. Holy moly, bro. Holy so holy fuck. Since we can create that, you can imagine how lengthy, verbose, and tedious is to build this. So let's get into this. Which is doing is in this way. Which is doing this in this way. So here we're gonna pass now is the elements here that we want to render, not like this. We do want is to now render these collections here. Alright. Something like this. And here you say, hey, create React element with this, where now the values that are gonna pass here, or the props that are gonna pass here are this, the key is a row, and the class name as this. You can get rid of this. Similar for this. Right. And now the function that it needs to be evaluated here, which is this. Range num column here, we're gonna do quite the same. And we're gonna repeat some of the operations here. Alright. Get rid of this. And then as the children, we want is now to pass is the call. And that'll be all. There you got it. Okay. So look at this thing. Holy fuck. And I do think that we need to add some, because this we need to indicate that this is flex call and flex direction column. But I do think that it needs to be done is here to indicate that this is a column here. Oh, cell class. That's a row, Jesus, that's a row. But this must be is here as a row. So it's taking all of this available space. I do okay, it needs to be a grid here. That's right. But display flex 1, flex direction row. Display flex and flex direction. Oh, because this must be a style, bro. That's what happened. Yeah. That's what happened. Now we get it. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Exactly. So here we go. Yep. That's what it is. And there you got it. So this is how we can create now. Holy moly. This is how can we create now is a flex. All right. Let's say here is the color white. So we can actually see those colors as it is. We can say HSL, or we can say here now HSL, something like 0, something close to 50%, and with a lightning of 50% as well. Interesting. Saturation maximum, a maximum lightning as it is. So you get the idea of this. But the point of this is that this is how you can create elements here on foot in JavaScript by returning each one of those elements. So now we actually understand truly how to do this. And what is this? Solution 2. Exactly. Solution 2, uh, pure JavaScript and GSX. No, pure GSX. Solution 2 is pure JavaScript. Holy fuck, that's horrible. Mm. 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 And the solution 3, all right? And the solution 3, that I know what it is a combo and this solution 3 is a combo with now class and and then solution 3 GSX and CSS, which is this another one. All right, and it makes a lot of sense. Holy moly, bro. That particular exercise, especially the rendering in grid. Rendering a grid. Exactly. Rendering a grid, or exercise 2 is rendering a grid. Okay, that was quite compelling, and this is why we're looking at that. So the next topic is this one. It's styling in React. React is opinionated when it comes to styling. As a result, there are dozens of options out there when it comes to pairing CSS with React. Technically, there is nothing stopping you from doing things the traditional way. You could keep a bunch of CSS file and include them with a link tag in your index HTML. But honestly, if you want to have the best experience building with React, there are better approaches. Remember when we talk about the components as we saw these graphs? Yes. The core idea with component is that each component is a bundle of markup in GSX, logic in JavaScript, and style in CSS. Our bottom component should own all the style related to that component. When we structure our code this way, something magical happens. Working with CSS becomes so much simpler. Exactly. When you combine that.
So let's suppose you've just been hired by Amazon as a front-end developer, and the first thing they want you to do is apply some sort of styling tweak to the navigation over here. So, you load it up in your browser and you go to check out the CSS, and my goodness, there is a lot of CSS that applies here. And, this is pretty typical for legacy sites, or really any site that uses traditional CSS styling methods that has been around for a while. Because what winds up happening is at some point you're working on this thing and you're in a different part of the code base and you need to apply an override to the styles that already exist. And if you already have this big selector as the thing applying styles and you have to overwrite it, right? You need to set a new margin for it. Well, you need to put an even larger selector, right? One that's even more specific. And so you wind up with this arms race where it's like ever incrementing selectors. And it just makes it really, really hard to understand what styles apply to a given element. Like if you're looking at the HTML and you see that you have this anchor text, there's not even a class name on this. Or no, there is, nav A. But it is really hard based on the markup to figure out where the different styles could be coming from because there's so many different places. Anywhere in the application can write a selector to style this particular nav link. Now, this isn't really a new problem. People have been coming up with solutions to this problem since long before React even existed, and one of the most popular solutions is called BEM. BEM stands for Block Elephant Block Element Modifier. And we'll take a quick look at an example. We have this search form class, right? And so the idea is we've created a block. We've created this search form is now going to be named search form. And the individual elements within that will have this suffix added to their class with 2 underscores. So we have an input, we have a button, and then we also have modifiers. So we have things like disabled or focused, and it doesn't even have to be like CSS pseudo classes. It could be like logged in. Essentially, this is this naming methodology you can use that simplifies things because you don't have this ever-escalating set of possible selectors, and it generally concentrates all the styles that apply to one element in one place. This is a very good thing, but it's not without its downsides. And the biggest downside in my mind to BEM is that the onus is on the developer, right? I have to remember to follow these sets of rules. So it requires like an incredible amount of vigilance and discipline because every time you want to style something, you have to remember to follow the formula. And knowing what I know about human nature, it is not simple to keep this going on a large team over time. People are going to get lazy, they're going to forget, they're going to write their own styles in their own way, and then the whole system kind of blows up. The other thing that's tricky about this is that every time you create a new block, it has to be a globally unique name. And that's probably easy at first, but eventually you're going to have 17 search forms on different parts of the thing, and they all have to have their own unique name. So you wind up with these really long compound names, like search form logged out homepage footer. And it just becomes a pain to work with when you have to repeat that long name for every element and every modifier. Essentially, BEM works well on small projects, but in my opinion, it doesn't really scale super well across larger projects or larger teams. And so when React started gaining popularity, people started getting even more creative with the solutions. Like, what if we could have this sort of system, but it could be done automatically so that the developer doesn't have to do anything. It just sort of happens on its own. And people have come up with all kinds of solutions, right? There's style components, emotion, vanilla extract, stitches. There's so many different implementations, but most of them solve the problem in a similar way in terms of automatic scoping. And it's a wonderful thing. It's so nice when we work with a CSS solution where we never have to worry about any of these problems. We can just write small, simple selectors and trust that those styles will be scoped to their component. And what it means is that even as the project gets bigger and bigger, you never have to hunt around the application to figure out where the styles live. So I realize this is all very abstract. In the next lesson, we're going to look at an implementation using one of these tools so you can see for yourself how nice it is.
Yeah. And it is CSS model. I'm a side note and contains some text. On this course platform has a side note component used to add tangential information. You have probably noticed them already. They look like this. I'm a side note, I contain some text. Let's build a simplified version of this component. Here's a rough sketch in terms of props and the markup. Okay. And here's how we style in CSS. So we now attach to that, and then we pass this to the style.wrapper. And now, holy moly, we can actually import that CSS, and then GSX now somehow is going to not only link this, but anytime it detects now and as a selector, it will convert that into an object, into a property of an object, so we can have access to this. Holy shit. There's a lot of weird stuff going on here, and I explained how this is all works. But first, I had to suggest spending a few moments poking at this yourself. Now, GSX, what it's doing is this. So GSX, what it's doing is, or when the code is evaluated as an import here, somehow, okay, all of the CSS selectors are now converted and exported into this object, like where we can have access to this. Don't know if this happened in JavaScript. I don't think so, because JavaScript doesn't work that way. I do think that happened is a GSX. But this is my thinking. You can learn more about Webpack tools of the trade. Naming the style import. In some tutorials, some CSS models, the import is named classes instead of a style. Ultimately, this is the same thing. Webpack treat the CSS model, it's the model bundler, as a default export, so we can have it, so we can name it whatever we like it. For more information, check the JavaScript models in here. But again, this is for JavaScript. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the weirdest thing about the code that we're looking at here is the fact that we're taking a CSS file that when we look at it looks like any other CSS file, and we're treating it like a JavaScript module. We're importing it the same way we'd import a React component or any other JavaScript file. And this is not actually part of the JavaScript specification, right? This is not a thing that can normally be done, but it's being done here with the power of tooling. The other thing I want to draw your attention to before we dig deeper into how this is even possible is the fact that the classes in this file are super short and generic. If you're not familiar with this convention with wrapper, the idea is we typically use this name when something wraps over other things. Like the top level element in our React component will often be called a wrapper, which means almost every component will have one of these, right? So surely I can't use wrapper like this because I'm going to have 100,000 of these in like a large application. It should probably be like side note dash wrapper, something like that. And then we also have to be really careful that I only have a single component called side note in the entire application. Well, this is where CSS modules comes in and gives us this little superpower. If we look at what this object actually is, right? Like what is style?
Exactly.
If we look at what this object does, this little superpower. Well, this is where CSS modules comes in and gives us this little superpower. If we look at what this object actually is, right? Like what is styles? Well, we can log it out and see what we get. And this is interesting, right? We have this object where the keys are the short classes we came up with, wrapper and title, and the values are these much longer strings that also have the same word in them, right? They both end in the same title and wrapper, but they have this big prefix of a bunch of stuff. And this prefix is what guarantees their uniqueness. This is what is actually used. So if we look at what we're doing over here, we're not setting this aside to wrapper the string, right? When I do that, the styles break. No, instead we're setting it to this much longer string, component side note module wrapper. And sure enough, if I look in the head of this document, right, if I go into the head and I find the final style tag, we see the styles that we've written, right? All the padding and background color. But they don't use the short names that we actually gave them, wrapper and title. They use these longer generated names. And so this is the core magic of CSS modules. We write these short names, and then the build process expands them out into these longer names. But as the developer, we never have to worry about these longer names. And the reason that this works is through Webpack. We've talked a little bit about how our React applications need to be compiled, right? Because what we have over here, this JSX, is not valid JavaScript. We have to turn that into these react.createElement calls. Well, during that same process, we can do other optimizations. We can use other features and other tools. And one of those tools is using Webpack loaders. If you're not familiar with Webpack, and let's be honest, most of us aren't, I do have a bonus lesson called Tools of the Trade that digs a little bit deeper into what Webpack is and how it fits into this big tool chain. But the important thing to know for right now is that when we write .module.css, this has a very specific meaning to Webpack, and it's the one that's going to go ahead and do these things that we've talked about, like creating longer names for each styles, injecting those longer names into the head of our HTML file, and then producing the styles object so we can use styles.title and styles.wrapper. Essentially what this means is that we get all the benefits of a naming methodology like BEM in terms of guaranteed unique class names, without any of the drawbacks of having to type and write and read these really long things, having to make sure that the things we're coming up with are in fact unique, and needing to have the superhuman discipline required to actually follow this methodology every time, right? There's none of the typical traps of human fallibility. All we have to do is use these short names that we come up with and use them on the styles object, and all the hard stuff kind of happens automatically. By the way, if you're wondering how these names are actually unique, because looking at them now, right? What if I have a different file that's also called sidenote.module? Well, it uses the file path. So you'll notice this sidenote.module.css is actually in the components directory. So the full path to this file is /components /sidenote.module.css, and that's what it uses for the prefix, right? Everything before these double underlines. And so because you can never have two files on the file system that exist in the same place, we know that these classes will be guaranteed unique. So that's how CSS modules work in a nutshell. We're going to use them in this course because I like that they come with this built-in scoping, but really, as in terms of actually writing it, it looks and feels like the vanilla CSS that we're all hopefully at least a little bit familiar with. There are many other tools that do similar things. Personally, I really like styled components, but we're going to focus on CSS modules because it requires the least amount of detouring. Style components is a really cool and amazing tool, and I wholeheartedly recommend it, but there is a bit of a learning curve there, and I want to keep us focused on the React and logic stuff. I have a whole other CSS course for the CSS stuff. So we're going to use CSS modules. Hopefully this was clear in terms of how they work, and the really nice thing is that for the most part, we can just write vanilla CSS, and as long as we access those classes from the styles object, everything just kind of connects together automatically.
So, and then we'll look at the exercise here. Never rely on color alone. Oops. Oh, when you want to dynamically access to this. Honey, I shrunk the kids. Office Space. Never heard about that movie. Definitely never heard about that movie. Okay. Never heard about that movie. The Groundhog Day. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, no, that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.